The warehouse reeked of cigarette smoke, sweat, and money changing hands in the dark. And then he walked in. No entrance, no music, no entourage. Just a man in mud-crusted work boots, a faded flannel shirt, and knuckles that had never seen a gym in his life. The crowd laughed. Cole Mercer, 23 fights, 23 finishes, looked across the ring and smiled. Nobody in that warehouse knew what Grant Holloway had buried inside himself. Nobody knew where he'd been, what he'd done, what he'd survived. They were about to find out. If this story hits different, subscribe, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. The heat hadn't broken in 9 days. That kind of heat doesn't just sit on you, it presses. It finds the cracks in old buildings, in old men, in old decisions you thought you'd buried deep enough to forget. It curls through broken window screens and settles into the lungs like something alive, something patient, something that knows it's already won. Grant Holloway had stopped noticing the heat somewhere around day 4. He was too busy watching everything he'd spent 14 years building slowly fall apart. His combine, a 2009 Case IH that he'd bought used, repaired twice, and babied through 6 harvests, had thrown its alternator belt on a Tuesday morning without so much as a warning light. Just a sound like a gunshot from the engine bay, then silence, then the awful stillness of a machine that had quit on you at exactly the wrong moment. 312 acres of winter wheat stood ready in the fields. The moisture content was perfect, 13%, the kind of number that made grain elevator managers nod with approval. The weather window was closing fast. A system was building over Kansas, the kind that meteorologists described in careful, neutral language, but that farmers read as disaster. Grant needed that combine running in 4 days. The alternator alone was $380. He had 62. He'd tried the bank first, which meant he'd driven the 40 minutes into Hardin Falls, and sat in a chair that was too nice for the conversation he was about to have, across from a loan officer named Derek, who had soft hands and a coffee that cost more than Grant's breakfast. Mr. Holloway. Derek had looked at him over reading glasses that probably cost $200. Your operating loan is already at its ceiling. We talked about this in April. I know what we talked about in April. And the equipment loan from the 21 season, I'm current on that. You're current, yes, but Derek had shuffled papers. The kind of shuffling that meant the answer was already no, and this was just the ceremony around it. There's very little room here, structurally speaking. Grant had stared at the small framed photo on Derek's desk. A family at a beach somewhere. Kids in life jackets on a boat. It's $380, Grant had said quietly. I understand that. And I've got wheat in the field right now that's worth $40,000 at current prices. I understand that too, Mr. Holloway. Grant had stood up. He hadn't slammed the door. He'd closed it carefully, because that's what you do when you've been trained not to make unnecessary noise, and that training doesn't leave you just because the war does. He'd called his neighbor Rudy Fassbender from the parking lot. Rudy was 64, farmed 800 acres of corn, and had the particular wisdom of a man who had outlasted most of his problems. How much you need? Rudy had asked. 400, maybe 450 with the labor. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone thinking about it. The silence of someone who already knew his answer and was figuring out how to say it human. Janet and I are upside down on the irrigation pivot, Grant. I can't. I'm sorry. I genuinely cannot. It's fine, Rudy. It's not fine. I wish it was. I'll figure it out. He'd hung up and sat in the truck for a long time with the windows down, listening to the heat. Done. He found out about the fights the way most people found out about things in Black Ridge County. By accident, in a gas station, from a man who was saying something he probably shouldn't have said loud enough for the whole store to hear. Grant was buying a bottle of water and a pack of antacids. The man behind him, heavy-set, mid-50s, wearing a Kubota hat with the brim broken sideways, was talking on his phone like the rest of the world was deaf. 60, maybe 70 guys last week. Cole put that Tulsa boy to sleep in under 2 minutes. I'm telling you, go early if you want a good spot near the front. Grant had stood at the counter, waiting for his change, and done the arithmetic without meaning to. Prize money at a fight like that. Under the table, cash in hand. He told himself he wasn't going to think about it. By the time he reached his truck, he was already thinking about it. The abandoned Harwell Grain Cooperative warehouse sat 3 miles east of town on a county road that used to carry semis but had been crumbling since the co-op went bankrupt in 2018. The building was enormous, 200 feet long, 50 feet wide, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow 30 feet up. The loading dock doors faced west, and someone had hung work lights every 20 feet along both walls, giving the interior a yellow, underwater quality that made everyone look slightly sick. Grant pulled into a gravel lot that already held 40 cars. Most of them had out-of-county plates. He sat in the truck for a moment. You don't have to do this, he thought. He got out of the truck. The crowd inside was louder than it looked from outside. Maybe 200 people, packed into bleacher sections that someone had assembled from portable risers, surrounding a fighting area that was nothing more than a wrestling mat, the kind with the faded lines from some high school gym, laid flat on the concrete floor. There was no cage, no ropes, just the mat and the crowd and the noise pressing down from the steel rafters above. Grant paid the $50 entry at a folding table near the door. The man taking money, enormous, neck like a fire hydrant, looked at him like he was paying to watch, not to fight. "You here to watch?" the man asked. "I'm here to fight," Grant said. The man looked at him. Grant was 6 feet even, 194 pounds. He was carrying it in his chest and shoulders in a way that didn't announce itself, but it was there. His hands were big and scarred at the knuckles in a way that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with work. His face had the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent 15 years doing things outdoors that aged you. He looked like a farmer. That was the problem, and also, tonight, the advantage. Name? Holloway. The man wrote it down without another look. Your 4th fight. Might go on around midnight. Stay near the back until they call you. Grant found a spot along the wall and watched. The first 2 fights were quick and ugly, bar brawlers with more aggression than technique, the kind of exchanges that produced bloody noses and separated shoulders and ended when someone got tired enough to lose. The crowd loved it. They were drinking from plastic cups, shouting suggestions at the fighters, making sounds that Grant found deeply familiar and not in any comfortable way. Baghdad, 2007. Crowds outside a market that had just been hit. The noise people make when the rules have temporarily stopped applying. He pushed the thought down and kept watching. The 3rd fight was different. Cole Mercer entered from the far end of the warehouse, and Grant understood immediately why the room changed when he walked through it. He was 28 years old, maybe 215 pounds, with the kind of physical conditioning that takes years of deliberate work. He moved with the loose, easy confidence of someone who had never been truly hurt in a fight, not because he hadn't been hit, but because nothing had ever hit him hard enough to leave a mark on the inside. He was wearing compression shorts and a sleeveless rash guard, and he walked through the crowd with his hands loose at his sides, bumping fists with the people near the aisle, grinning at something one of his people said into his ear. His opponent lasted 90 seconds. It wasn't even competitive. Cole moved with technical precision, double leg entry, back take, rear naked choke finished before the other man understood what position he was in. The crowd exploded. Cole stood up, arms wide, soaking it in like sunlight. Then his manager, a wiry guy in his 40s named Stokes, who Grant had overheard near the entry table, spotted Grant along the wall. Stokes walked over with the kind of smile that meant he was calculating something. "You the farmer?" Stokes asked. "That's one word for it." "You really want to go in there with Cole?" Grant looked at him. "I need to talk about the prize money first." Stokes blinked. Then he laughed. A short, surprise sound. "Man's got priorities." "I respect that." He tilted his head. 500 if you last 2 rounds. 800 if you win. 850, Grant said. 850. Stokes looked at him with something that wasn't quite respect, but was adjacent to it. "Sure, 850. You're not going to win, but 850 if you do." "That's fine." "You ever fought before?" Grant looked back at the mat, where Cole was still working the crowd, still grinning. "Not like this," Grant said. There were maybe 40 minutes between his agreement and his call-up. He spent most of it standing in the same spot along the wall, not talking to anyone, running through something in his head that looked like nothing from the outside, just a man standing still, eyes slightly unfocused, but was actually a process he'd learned to do under circumstances that made this warehouse look like a church social. Threat assessment, environmental read, physical inventory. The mat was approximately 20 feet by 24. The crowd pressed close on 3 sides. The fourth was the wall behind him. If Cole took him to the ground, the crowd would interfere with recovery space on his right. The work lights overhead were positioned to throw slight shadows in the southeast corner of the mat, a detail that was probably meaningless but that his brain filed anyway, because his brain had been trained to file everything. His ribs were fine. His left knee had been aching since May, a recurring thing that flared in the heat. His hands hadn't thrown a real punch in. He didn't count the years. Long enough. He wasn't afraid. That was the thing people misread about him constantly, in this warehouse and in every other room he'd walked into for the past decade. They looked at him and saw a man who seemed defeated, tired eyes, slow movements, no visible aggression, and they interpreted that as weakness or resignation. It wasn't either of those things. It was discipline. Holloway! The man at the table was waving at him. The crowd had already shifted, sensing the next thing. Grant pulled off his flannel shirt and hung it on a nail in the wall, leaving on the plain white undershirt beneath. He unlaced his work boots, Wolverine 1,000 miles, 7 years old, resoled twice, and set them side by side beneath his flannel. He pulled the tape from his jeans pocket and wrapped his own hands, not elaborately, just enough to protect the metacarpals on contact. He walked to the mat. The crowd registered him slowly, the way a stadium registers a punchline they didn't see coming. First silence, then murmurs, then laughter. Not mean exactly, but the kind of laughter that happens when something is surprising in a small, stupid way. Is that a farmer? Who found this guy in a field somewhere? Cole's going to apologize after. Cole himself was standing at the opposite edge of the mat, bouncing lightly on his toes, watching Grant cross the room with an expression that was genuinely curious. Not mean, just curious. The way you look at something that doesn't quite fit the category you're trying to put it in. They stood 4 feet apart. Cole looked at the tape on Grant's hands, looked at the work shirt undershirt, looked at the Wolverine tan line on his forearms where the flannel had ended. Hey, Cole said. Not unkind. You sure about this? I'm sure, Grant said. Last chance to just ring the bell, son. Something shifted in Cole's face. Not anger, just the decision to stop being polite about it. The bell was someone's phone alarm going off at ringside. It sounded like a rooster. Cole came forward immediately. That was correct. That was exactly what Grant would have done. Come forward fast. Establish pace and distance. Don't let the unknown variable get settled. Cole threw a jab-cross combination that cracked the humid air 4 inches from Grant's ear, following it with a leg kick to the outside of Grant's left thigh that landed clean and sent a shock of heat up his hip. The crowd roared. Grant retreated 2 steps. He wasn't running, he was reading. Every fighter has a rhythm in the first 20 seconds that they establish without knowing they're establishing it. Cole's was probe, load, explode. The jab was bait. The cross was the real shot. And after the cross, he dropped his right hand slightly, just slightly, before resetting. There, something in Grant thought. Not excited, just noting. Cole threw the sequence again. Jab, cross, leg kick. Then a knee from the clinch when Grant didn't create distance fast enough, catching him in the upper thigh rather than the body. Cole was going for points on the legs, trying to erode mobility. Smart. Against most opponents, correct. Grant absorbed the knee without changing his breathing. Stay technical, Cole's corner was saying. He doesn't know how to... Yeah, there you go. The third sequence came harder. Cole had decided the farmer was slow, and he wasn't wrong exactly, but he was misreading what the slowness meant. He loaded a right hand that had genuine force behind it, torquing from the hip the way you do when you've decided to end something, and he threw it at the center of Grant's face. Grant slipped it by 2 inches to the outside, and then stepped in. Not a punch. Not yet. Just a shove, both hands, centered on Cole's chest. At the exact moment Cole's weight was committed forward, and his base was wrong. Cole went down like a man who'd stepped off a curb he didn't see. It happened fast. He was up immediately. Trained reflexes, good hips, he was off the mat in under a second. But the damage was already done. Not to his body, to the room. The laughter died so completely and so suddenly that Grant could hear the industrial fans in the rafters, the creak of the bleachers as people leaned forward, the sound of someone's plastic cup hitting the concrete floor in the sudden stillness. Cole stood on the far side of the mat, chest rising and falling, eyes recalibrated. Grant stood exactly where he had been standing, hands up, face empty. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't performing, he was waiting. "What?" someone in the crowd said, very quietly. Cole looked at Grant with different eyes now, not curious anymore, not polite, not performing for the crowd. This was something older and more honest. He rolled his neck. He reset his stance. He came forward again, and this time there was no jab cross setup, no leg kick entry. He came with everything. The crowd felt it and surged forward with him, noise rising again, filling the warehouse, shaking the work lights in their clips. And Grant exhaled once, slowly, through his nose. Here we go, he thought, not afraid, not excited, just present. Because whatever came through that hot, yellow-lit air toward him in the next 30 seconds, he had been in worse places than this, much worse. And the man across the mat had no idea what he was actually looking at. He was about to find out. The combination hit Grant in the guard, left hook, right uppercut, left elbow that clipped the top of his eyebrow and opened a thin red line that immediately sent blood tracking down into his eye socket. The crowd noise became something physical. Someone grabbed Grant's arm from ringside, and Grant shrugged them off without looking, keeping his eyes fixed on Cole, who was circling left now, faster, breathing harder, clearly bewildered that the farmer was still standing with the same empty, patient expression he'd had since the bell rang. Cole threw again, a flying knee that Grant barely got an arm up to deflect, the impact shuddering up his forearm into his shoulder like hitting a fence post. And in the process of deflecting it, Grant stepped into a position he hadn't planned but immediately recognized. Inside the pocket, right of center. His weight is on the left foot. The muscle memory was older than Black Ridge County, older than the farm. It lived in a part of him that he had spent 10 years trying to put to sleep. It woke up anyway. Grant's right hand moved. Not a haymaker, not a wild swing. A short, compact hook to the floating rib. The kind of strike that doesn't look like much from the outside and feels like a car door closing on your side from the inside. The kind taught not in gyms, but in places where you needed to stop someone now without the option of a second attempt. Cole's face went white. His legs didn't buckle. He was too conditioned for that, but something changed in his body's relationship with the ground beneath it, and for 1/2 second, with blood in Grant's eye and 200 people screaming and the heat pressing down from the ceiling like a physical weight, Cole Mercer looked afraid. The crowd felt it before they understood it. And Grant Holloway looked at the man across the mat with eyes that were quiet and old and had seen things that no amount of gym time would ever prepare you for. And he thought, without satisfaction, without anger, without any performance at all, 4 rounds or less. Then I'm going home. The half-second stretched. Cole Mercer stood on the far edge of that wrestling mat, with his chin tucked and his hands up and his eyes doing the thing eyes do when the brain behind them is rapidly revising every assumption it walked in with. The fear that had crossed his face was gone now, trained out of him, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. But Grant had seen it, and that was enough. You couldn't unsee a man's face in that moment. You couldn't unfeel what it meant. The crowd hadn't fully processed what had happened yet. They were loud again, filling the warehouse with noise that bounced off the corrugated steel walls and came back distorted. But it was a different kind of loud now. Before, they'd been laughing. Now they were leaning forward. There's a specific sound a crowd makes when it realizes it's watching something it didn't expect, and this was that sound, higher pitched, faster, with an edge of something that wasn't quite comfortable. Cole rolled his shoulders and reset. Grant blinked blood out of his left eye. The cut above his eyebrow was shallow. Eyebrow cuts always bled worse than they were. Something about the vascularity of the forehead. But it was painting the left side of his face in a thin, bright red sheet that he could taste at the corner of his mouth when he pressed his lips together. He didn't reach up to wipe it, didn't change his stance, just adjusted his angle slightly to keep Cole in his clear right eye's sightline. Cole came in lower this time. That was the adjustment. Less stand-up, get it to the ground, use the size and the training. It was the correct call against most opponents. Against someone with a wrestling background or a boxing background, you switch dimensions, make them fight somewhere they're less comfortable. It was textbook. It was smart. Cole shot for a double-leg takedown with the kind of speed and technique that won tournaments. Hips low, head to the outside, driving forward with his legs like a sprinter coming off the blocks. Grant sprawled. Not perfectly. His left knee screamed at him, and his base wasn't as wide as it should have been because the knee didn't allow it, but well enough. His hips dropped, his weight shifted back, and Cole's arms found thighs instead of hips, which changed the leverage equation completely. They ground fought for 4 ugly seconds in a way that looked nothing like a sport, and everything like two people genuinely trying to control another human being. Cole muscled for an underhook. Grant locked a whizzer with his right arm, applying downward pressure on Cole's shoulder that turned the takedown attempt into a stall. The crowd noise went up another notch. "Get him down, Cole! He's gassing. Go to the body." They separated. Both breathing harder now. Cole's rash guard had a streak of blood on the left shoulder from where Grant's face had pressed against him during the scramble. It looked, Grant thought distantly, like a wound that wasn't there. Cole's corner man, a compact guy with a shaved head named Darius, who'd been calling combinations from ringside since the first bell, was talking fast and quiet, and Cole was listening with his eyes still on Grant, which was the right instinct. "You didn't look away. Not now. Check the leg. Check the leg. He's favoring that left knee. You see it? Go low left on the kick, break his base down, then you shoot." Grant heard it. The warehouse wasn't big enough, and the crowd wasn't loud enough to cover a corner man talking 8 feet away. He filed it, adjusted his weight distribution without making it obvious, shifting to mask the tell. Cole noticed anyway. The slight frown that crossed his face said so. "You heard that," Cole said. Not a question. Grant didn't answer. "Okay," Cole said, almost to himself. The grin was gone. What replaced it was something more honest and, in its way, more respectful. He moved forward. The next 2 minutes were the hardest of the fight so far, and not because Cole was doing anything wrong. He was doing almost everything right, working the body with short hooks after his jabs landed, twice clinching and landing knees to Grant's thighs that were going to leave bruises the color of storm clouds, staying disciplined about not overcommitting after the first knockdown that wasn't a knockdown but felt like one. He was fighting smart and mean and precise, and Grant was eating enough of it to make the crowd believe he was losing. He wasn't losing, but he wasn't comfortable either. The left knee was real. 3 months ago, he'd tweaked the MCL baling hay. Not a tear, just an aggravation of an old injury that the VA had looked at twice without doing much about. And Cole's repeated attacks on the outside of his left thigh were talking to it in a way that was becoming difficult to manage. Not debilitating. Not yet. But a sustained campaign against that leg over the next few rounds would compound. Mobility was going to become a negotiation rather than a given. Manage the timeline, something in him said. Old voice. Calm. The voice that had talked to him in places where calm was the only thing between a decision and a catastrophe. Don't fight a 4-round fight. Make it shorter. Easier to think than to execute against someone with Cole Mercer's engine. Cole threw a right cross that Grant partially blocked, the force of it torquing his guard back into his own face, and immediately followed with a left hook to the body that slid under the compromised guard and landed flush on Grant's left side, 3 inches below the armpit. The pain was immediate and complete. Not sharp, deep, the kind that lived in the breathing. Grant exhaled hard and clinched before the follow-up could land, grabbing Cole's right arm and pressing his head against Cole's shoulder, and for 3 seconds they just held each other in that ugly, tired way that fighters hold each other when one of them needs a moment. Cole felt it. "Yeah," he said, voice quiet and close. Not gloating, almost gentle. "That one got you." Grant said nothing. He was counting his own heartbeats. Assessing. 2 ribs. Maybe 1. Not broken, cracked at worst, bruised more likely, but the sensation of breathing was going to be a problem for the rest of the fight. Every inhale was going to pull at that spot. Every exhale was going to remind him it was there. The referee, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Boggs, who clearly just wanted nobody to die on his mat, separated them with both hands and gave Grant a 3-second look that asked without words whether he wanted to continue. Grant nodded once and reset his stance. Boggs stepped back. Cole came forward. The crowd, which had been briefly holding its collective breath during the clinch, erupted again. Someone near the front was hitting a plastic folding chair against the bleacher railing in a rhythm that other people started matching. The noise built into something that pressed against the eardrums. 40 feet up in the rafters, a family of pigeons exploded off a steel beam and vanished into the shadows. "He's done," someone behind Grant said, didn't bother lowering his voice. "Old man's done, just a matter of time." Grant heard it. He'd been hearing versions of that sentence for most of his adult life, in various languages, in various contexts, from various people who were trying to be accurate rather than cruel. It had stopped meaning anything to him sometime around age 26, in a country far from here, in a situation that made this warehouse look like a Sunday afternoon. Cole threw a combination, jab, jab, right cross, and Grant slipped the last one and countered with a right hand to the body, same area Cole had just hit him. Shorter, more deliberate. Cole grunted and shelled up, and Grant didn't follow it because following it was what Cole expected, and what Darius at ringside was already shouting for Cole to defend. Instead, Grant backed off 2 steps and let Cole reset. Darius stopped shouting. That was interesting to the people watching, if they were watching closely. Most weren't. They were watching Cole because Cole was the story they'd come here for. They were watching the blood on Grant's face and the way he was carrying his left side slightly and interpreting both of those things as evidence of an ending that was coming soon. 3 men near the side wall had already stopped watching the fight altogether and were talking among themselves, heads together, counting money-changing hands. Stokes, Grant's manager for the night, was standing near the entry table with his arms crossed and an expression that had shifted from amusement to something he hadn't expected to feel tonight, which was mild concern. "Kid's gotta close this," Stokes said, to no one in particular. "Should have closed this already." Cole threw a high kick, left leg, targeting the temple, and it was fast enough that Grant only partially got his guard up, the shin glancing off the top of his forearm and the side of his head simultaneously, snapping his neck sideways and filling his vision with a bright, white-hot flash that lasted about a half-second too long. He went sideways. Didn't go down. His base was wide enough and his legs were strong enough from 14 years of farm work, but he went sideways and stumbled, and the crowd came up off the bleachers. Boggs moved in. "You good? You good?" "Fine," Grant said, and he meant it in the strict physical sense. He was upright. His vision had cleared. The flash was gone. His ears were ringing slightly in a way that was familiar from contexts he didn't think about in public. "I can stop it." "Don't stop it." Boggs looked at him for a full second. Then he stepped back. Cole had retreated to the far side of the mat during the check, bouncing on his toes, and when Boggs stepped back, Cole came forward again but slower, reading the room, reading Grant, doing the sensible thing, and waiting to see if the stumble had changed something fundamental. It hadn't. But Grant let him believe it might have. He dropped his guard slightly, rolled his neck, let his left shoulder drop a 1/4 inch in a way that looked like fatigue but was actually an invitation, a specific, deliberate exposure of the left side of his jaw that any trained fighter would read as an opening. Cole read it. He loaded the right hand from just outside striking distance, weight transferring from his back foot to his front, hips beginning to rotate. Grant was already moving. He stepped offline to his right, outside Cole's power line, and the right hand passed through empty air. In the same movement, he drove his left elbow into the space Cole's head had occupied a half-second ago, catching Cole's ear with enough force to change the equilibrium of his inner ear in a way that wasn't devastating but was deeply disorienting. Cole stumbled. Not a fall, not a knockdown. A stumble. 3 shuffling steps to his right to keep his feet under him, head ducked, hands reaching for balance. But the crowd saw it and went completely silent in the same way a room goes silent when someone drops something breakable and everyone is waiting to hear if it shattered. Grant did not follow him. He stood in the middle of the mat and let Cole find his feet and turn back around. Darius was saying something from ringside. His voice was tight now, the casual confidence gone out of it, replaced by the sound of a man recalculating. Shake it off! Shake it off, Cole! You're fine! Stay disciplined! Cole turned around. His eyes were bright and clear. He was fine, physically. But there was something working behind them now that hadn't been there at the beginning of the fight. Not fear exactly. More like the specific unease of a man who is very good at a thing and has just encountered evidence that the rules of that thing might not apply here the way they're supposed to. He looked at Grant. Grant looked back at him. "Where'd you learn that?" Cole asked. His voice was different. Still controlled, but different. Grant said nothing. "The elbow, that entry, where'd you—" Cole stopped himself. He understood that the question didn't matter and that asking it was a kind of concession. He reset his stance. "Doesn't matter." "No," Grant said, "it doesn't." Cole came forward again, and this time there was nothing performative about it. He'd stopped fighting for the crowd 10 minutes ago, which was when you knew a fight had become real. He was fighting Grant now, not the version of Grant he'd walked in expecting, but the actual man on the mat in front of him, deliberate, patient, economical in a way that was deeply uncomfortable to fight against because it gave you nothing to read. He threw a leg kick that landed clean on Grant's outer thigh. Then another, then a third. He was going back to the plan, break the base down, get the knee involved, change the game. And it was working in the sense that each kick sent a shockwave up Grant's hip that his face was having trouble not showing. "Left leg," Darius was saying, more quietly now, like he didn't want Grant to hear. Too late. "He can't check it. Keep going." Grant checked the fourth kick badly, got his shin up, but the angle was wrong because of the knee, and the impact was absorbed mostly by his calf instead of the bone-on-bone deflection that makes leg kicks expensive to throw. Cole felt the difference and loaded the fifth one harder. Grant didn't check it. He caught it. Left arm trapping Cole's kicking leg at the ankle, right hand already moving. Not a punch, a shove to the shoulder that used Cole's own momentum to spin him sideways while Grant maintained the leg, stepping into him, crowding him, turning the kick into a trip that dumped Cole onto the mat on his left side with a sound that was half collision and half surprise. Cole scrambled. He was on his feet in under 2 seconds. Good hips, good reflexes, no panic. But those 2 seconds in which Grant had been standing over him with the option to do damage and had simply stepped back and let him up communicated something to everyone in the warehouse. Not mercy, not showboating, something colder than either of those. Boggs was watching with his mouth slightly open. He'd been refereeing underground fights for 11 years and he'd seen a lot of things, but the specific texture of what was happening on this mat was new to him, and he didn't have a word for it yet. Cole stood up and looked at Grant for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said. It was quiet enough that only Grant and Boggs heard it. It wasn't a taunt, it was a real question. Grant's face gave him nothing. "Just a farmer," Grant said. Cole shook his head once, not disagreeing exactly, more like setting something aside to deal with later, and came forward again. But the rhythm had changed. The certainty that had defined his movement since the first bell was gone now, replaced by something more careful and more cautious. And careful and cautious against Grant Holloway was, it was turning out, exactly the wrong gear to be in. Because carefully cautious gave Grant time. And time was the one thing Grant Holloway had always known how to use. The crowd had come back to life gradually, in stages, the way electricity comes back on after a power cut, first one section, then another, the noise building not in the explosive single burst of the early rounds, but in a continuous swell that had a different quality to it. These weren't people screaming for blood anymore. They were people watching something they didn't understand and couldn't look away from, which is a much more powerful thing. The man who'd said Grant was done, the one behind him who hadn't bothered to lower his voice, was quiet now. Grant didn't look to confirm it. He didn't need to. Cole threw a body kick with his right leg, loading it from the hip, and Grant moved to counter. But the kick was a feint, Cole dropping his foot before full extension and converting the motion into a clinch, grabbing Grant behind the head with both hands and driving a knee upward with everything he had. It landed. Lower than intended, Grant had read the clinch entry and dropped his chin, bringing his elbow down to partially deflect. But it landed on the left side of Grant's ribs, the same side that had taken the hook earlier. And the sound it made was flat and dense and wrong, in a way that traveled across the mat and reached the front row before the crowd noise covered it. Grant felt his vision tunnel for just a moment. Not white this time. Gray. A gray narrowing at the edges that his body produced when something significant had just happened to it. He kept his hands up. He kept his feet under him. He breathed out slowly through his nose in a long, controlled exhale that his body did not want to perform because the left side of his ribcage was sending urgent signals about how bad an idea breathing was right now. $380. Replace the alternator. Get the combine running. Get back into the field before the storm. That was the entire equation. That was the only thing in the world that mattered. Cole pressed the clinch, trying to land another knee. Grant blocked it with his thigh, tied up Cole's right arm with a whizzer, and they ground against each other for 5 seconds that felt like a minute. Grant's ribs screaming at him, Cole working for position, both of them breathing hard and going nowhere. "Break," Boggs said, and stepped between them. They separated. Grant turned away from Cole for the first time in the fight, just for a moment. Ostensibly adjusting his hand wrap, the tape on his left hand had loosened slightly, and in that moment, with his back partially angled to the crowd, he allowed himself one breath that he didn't control. One breath that his body took on its own terms, sharp and deep, and pulled in against resistance from the left side that made him squeeze his eyes shut for the half second it lasted. One of the men in the front row saw it. An older man, 60s, trucker hat, sitting alone in a folding chair he'd brought himself. He'd been quiet the whole fight, not part of the crowd noise, just watching. When Grant turned back around, this man was looking at him with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't contempt. It was recognition. The look of someone who knew what it meant to do something painful and keep doing it because stopping wasn't really an option. Grant didn't know the man. He met his eyes for half a second anyway, the way you sometimes meet a stranger's eyes across a room and know without words that you are, in some way that matters, the same kind of person. Then he turned back to Cole. His left side was on fire. His knee was talking to him. The blood above his eye had slowed to a trickle, but had dried along his cheekbone in a way that made the left side of his face feel stiff. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with the last 3 years of being a single man trying to keep a farm alive through drought and debt and a combine that decided to die on him in July. Cole came in again. Lower stance now. More patient. He'd made his adjustments. Read the rib, read the knee, understood that the farming trick with the elbow was a real tool in a real toolbox. And he was being smart about it. And being smart about it meant being methodical. And methodical meant this fight was going to last longer than Cole had intended, which meant Grant was going to absorb more damage than he could afford. Unless the right moment. It would come. It always came. You just had to be in condition to recognize it when it arrived. And right now, Grant Holloway was not at his best in terms of being in condition to do anything, but the moment would come regardless. Cole threw a jab to measure distance. Grant moved back. Cole threw it again. Grant moved back again. "You running?" someone in the crowd shouted. Grant wasn't running. He was creating space, and in creating space, he was watching Cole's footwork. The small adjustments Cole made when he closed distance. The way his right heel came up a half inch too early before the power right. The way his eyes dropped for a fraction of a second before he committed to a takedown entry. Small things. Nothing things to anyone who didn't know what they meant. Grant knew what they meant. He needed one more round, maybe less. He needed Cole to give him one moment where those small things aligned, where the heel came up and the eyes dropped and the momentum was committed. And then the thing that lived in the part of him he'd spent 10 years trying to quiet would do what it had been built to do. One moment. Cole circled left, loading his weight, and his right heel came up. Grant's entire body shifted in the same fraction of a second. Not yet. The eyes hadn't dropped. It was the heel without the eyes, which was preparation without commitment. And going on preparation was how you got countered by a man who was faster than he looked. Grant held. Cole's weight shifted back. His heel settled. The moment passed. Darius exhaled from ringside. Grant watched Cole's face across the mat. The concentration there. The focus. The first faint signs of something that wasn't quite frustration but was trending in that direction, and he understood something about this young man that the young man probably didn't know about himself yet. Cole Mercer had never fought someone who wasn't afraid of him. Not at his level. Everyone at his level had been afraid. And fear made people predictable, and predictability was what his style was built to exploit. Grant wasn't afraid. And that was slowly, steadily, invisibly breaking something in Cole that no amount of training could fix, because it wasn't a technical problem. It was a psychological one. Cole threw the right hand. The heel came up. The eyes dropped. And Grant Holloway finally, unhurriedly, moved. Grant moved offline to his right. Same direction as before, because Cole expected him to vary it, and varying it was what Cole was set up to defend. And the right hand passed through empty air for the second time in the fight, which meant Cole's brain was now 2 for 2 on a mistake his body had warned him against, and he hadn't listened. The difference this time was what Grant did after. Before, he'd used the elbow, a single point of contact, disorienting, controlled. A tool he'd deployed once and then filed away because tools lost value the second time you used them against someone paying attention. This time, he went low. His right hand caught Cole's extended wrist on the way past, not grabbing, just redirecting, like changing the course of water rather than stopping it. And he stepped inside Cole's guard with his left foot and drove his left shoulder into Cole's chest at the exact moment Cole's weight was forward and his base was committed to the punch he'd already thrown. The physics were simple and ugly and effective. Cole's momentum plus Grant's weight plus the step-in created a combined force that Cole's legs weren't positioned to absorb. Cole went down for the second time. This fall was harder than the first. He hit the mat on his right side, hip first, and the sound of it, a flat, dense crack of 215 pounds of conditioned muscle hitting rubber over concrete, cut through the crowd noise like something sharp through something soft. He rolled immediately, trained reflexes bringing him back to his feet before Boggs could even move to check, but the roll was off. His right hip had taken the impact. He came up favoring it slightly, maybe 2 degrees off his usual stance, and Grant saw it and cataloged it without changing his expression. The crowd had gone through the silence and come out the other side into something Grant hadn't heard yet tonight. A low, continuous murmur that wasn't cheering and wasn't booing and was somehow louder than either. The sound of 200 people simultaneously revising an opinion. Darius, at ringside, had stopped talking. That was the most significant thing. From the first bell, Darius had been a constant presence. Calling combinations, calling angles, managing Cole's pace and positioning from 8 feet away with the quiet authority of a man who'd trained fighters for 20 years. His silence now had a texture to it, the texture of a man watching something he'd prepared his fighter for and realizing the preparation had gaps. Cole stood up and looked at Grant. The anger was there. It was always there after a fall. That was human and unavoidable. But underneath the anger was something else now. Something more uncomfortable than anger. Something that looked, in the yellow work light of the warehouse, a lot like the moment before a man decides to stop playing by the rules he walked in with. Grant recognized it. He'd seen it before, in different contexts, in different people, in situations where the stakes were something other than prize money. It meant the next few minutes were going to be less technical. "Walk away," Cole said. His voice was different, lower. The performance was gone out of it. "Seriously, take the 200 for lasting this long and walk away." "850, Grant said. "That's what we agreed." That was before... Cole stopped. He looked down at the mat for 1 second, then back up. "You're going to get hurt." "I'm already hurt." "More hurt." Grant said nothing. Cole shook his head. It wasn't a shake of frustration. It was the head shake of a man letting something go. Some version of restraint, some professional consideration about how much was appropriate, and what replaced it in his face when the shaking stopped was rawer and more honest and considerably more dangerous. Darius found his voice again. "Cole, discipline. Stay technical." Cole didn't appear to hear him. He came forward, and it was different now in the way that a car with the governor removed is different from the same car with it engaged. Same machine, entirely different ceiling. The combinations were faster and meaner and less concerned with setup, straight aggression layered over just enough technique to be genuinely difficult to manage. He drove a knee into Grant's right thigh, followed it with an elbow to the side of Grant's head that Grant barely slipped, the point of the elbow skimming his ear with enough force to make his eardrum flutter. Grabbed Grant's head in the clinch and tried to drag him down into a guillotine, and Grant tucked his chin and powered out of it with everything his neck had, which was enough, but barely. They ended up against the edge of the mat, near the crowd, close enough that Grant could smell cigarette smoke and beer sweat from the front row. Someone's hand touched his shoulder. Not Boggs, a spectator, and Grant shrugged it off with his elbow without looking. "Get back on the mat," Boggs was saying, moving to separate them, and Cole released and they both stepped back to center. Grant was breathing hard. His ribs were alive with something that went beyond pain into a kind of bright, specific awareness, the body's way of insisting you understand the situation. His left knee had started to lock between movements, a half second of stiffness at extension that was going to become a problem if this went much longer. The cut above his eye had reopened during the clinch, and he could feel the blood moving again, warm and slow, collecting at his cheekbone. He ran a quick internal assessment, the kind that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with function. Ribs. Compromised. Not catastrophic. He could breathe. It hurt. He could work with it. Knee. Degrading. 15 more minutes of this and mobility would be significantly reduced. Eye. Negligible. Bleed without depth, not affecting vision beyond minor peripheral obstruction. Hands. Good. The tape had held. Head. Clear. No significant impact to the skull. The ear hit hadn't caused any real concussive symptom. Overall, he had a window, not a large one. The window was measured not in rounds but in minutes, and it was getting smaller. Cole threw again. A body kick with the left leg that Grant stepped into and smothered rather than absorbing, tying it up short and keeping it from fully developing, which wasn't a counter so much as damage mitigation. And Grant felt the impact anyway through the block, felt it in his ribs, felt it in the cold, specific way you feel something that's been hit before being hit again. He exhaled. Reset. The warehouse was hot in a way that had stopped being about temperature. The air felt different now, thicker, compressed by the noise and the bodies, and the particular electricity of a crowd that had arrived expecting entertainment and found itself watching something else, something it didn't entirely have language for. Grant had felt this before, not in a warehouse, not in front of a crowd, but the feeling itself was familiar. The feeling of a situation narrowing, options condensing, the math of a moment becoming simpler and more violent, whether you wanted it to or not. Cole threw a straight right and then a left hook, and then, departing from his established pattern for the first time in the fight, an immediate second right hand, the same hand twice in sequence, which was the kind of thing you did when you were angry enough to stop being predictable. The second right hand landed. It caught Grant on the left cheekbone, below the cut, which was maybe fortunate, a half-inch higher, and it would have opened the cut into something that Boggs would have had to stop, and the force of it was significant, the kind of force you generate when you stop thinking about generating force and just generate it. Grant's head snapped right. His legs stayed under him. But the world tilted for a moment, and he stumbled 2 steps sideways in a way that was not controlled and not planned, his left knee locking in the stumble, and he hit the edge of the mat with his right foot and went down on one knee. The warehouse exploded. Not cheering exactly, the crowd had been recalibrated too many times tonight for pure cheering, but something primal and loud that came out of 200 chests simultaneously, the noise of people witnessing the specific moment they'd been promised at the beginning of the night. The farmer was down. The champion had landed. The natural order had reasserted itself. Boggs was there immediately. "You down? You down?" "Standing count," Grant said. He was back on his feet before Boggs finished the sentence, but his left knee had locked fully on the way up, and he had to straighten it with a deliberate, visible effort that cost him in ways he didn't want the room to see. Boggs looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man who had stopped many fights and was trying to determine whether this was one of those moments. "I'm fine," Grant said. "You don't look fine." "I'm standing," Grant said. "Let us go." Boggs stepped back. Cole had retreated to his corner of the mat during the count, and Darius was in his ear now, one hand on his shoulder, talking quietly and fast. Cole was listening this time. His chest was heaving. He was burning more energy than he'd intended tonight, more than any of his previous 23 fights had required, and the set of his face had the particular look of a man who is winning and knows it and still isn't sure why winning feels this uncomfortable. "Finish it," Darius was saying. "Right now, finish it. Body, body, head." You have him. Just finish it. Cole nodded. He came forward, and then something happened inside Grant Holloway that he had not invited and could not have stopped. It started in the chest, in the breathing, the sharp intake against the damaged ribs doing something to the rhythm of it, a specific pattern of constricted breath that his nervous system had apparently filed in a folder it had never fully closed, because the next thing Grant was aware of, layered over the warehouse and the crowd and Cole coming forward with murder in his professional intentions, was sound, radio static, not real, not audible, interior. The particular hiss and crackle of a tactical radio going to carrier wave, the sound that meant someone on the other end had keyed the mic and wasn't speaking yet because what they had to say was too significant to say quickly. He'd heard that sound, that specific, identical pause of static before transmission, on maybe 40 occasions in his life. He remembered each of them. He remembered what had come after each of them. Ramirez, his mind said, without his permission. A name. A face. A morning in a place he hadn't spoken about to anyone in Blackridge County or anywhere else. A narrow street, the smell of diesel and hot concrete, and something chemical that had no business being in the air. A radio on his vest going to static in the half-second before the world came apart. Grant blinked. Cole was 4 feet away and closing. The memory didn't overwhelm him. It never did. Not anymore. What it did was something more specific and more difficult to explain. It stripped away the 12 years between that street and this warehouse and left him in the state he'd been in during that mission, which was a state that had nothing to do with adrenaline or anger or any of the things civilians associated with combat. It was the opposite of those things. It was a cold, total, almost terrifying calm. The quiet farmer vanished. Cole threw the first strike of his finishing sequence, a straight left to the body, exactly as Darius had instructed, and Grant didn't block it and didn't dodge it. He caught Cole's left wrist in his right hand, pivoted 90 degrees to his own right, applied downward pressure to the wrist while simultaneously driving his left elbow into the crook of Cole's extended arm, and used the resulting lock to redirect Cole's entire forward momentum, 215 pounds of it, past him and down. Cole hit the mat for the third time. This time the crowd didn't make any noise, not immediately. There was a silence that lasted maybe 2 full seconds, which is an enormous silence in a room with 200 people in it, and then a single voice somewhere in the back said something that nobody afterward could quite agree on the exact words of, but which had the cadence of a man who had just watched something he couldn't explain. Cole rolled. He came up. He was breathing hard, and there was something in his eyes that was not what Grant had seen there before. Not the revision of assumptions, not the calculation, not even the anger. This was older and more animal. This was the thing that lives at the bottom of every fighter's psychology. The thing that training and competition and 23 wins had buried under enough layers of professional confidence that Cole had probably forgotten it was there. He was scared. Not scared enough to stop. He had too much invested in his record, in his reputation, in the version of himself that the crowd and Darius and everyone who knew him believed in, to stop. But the fear was there, and it was doing what fear does to technique, which is make it smaller and faster and less precise. He came in throwing. Grant moved with him. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not a fight in any sense that the crowd had been trained to recognize by the previous rounds. There were no big strikes, no exchanges, no moments that would photograph well or cut together cleanly for a highlight reel. It was a series of small, ruthless, almost invisible redirections. Cole throwing, Grant not being where Cole threw, Grant's hands finding positions on Cole's body that weren't strikes so much as corrections, adjustments, the application of physics to the problem of a man who was coming at him hard with everything he had. Every time Cole surged, Grant made him pay for the surge by making the surge go somewhere Cole hadn't intended. It looked from the outside almost effortless. It was not effortless. Every movement pulled at Grant's ribs in a way that was becoming something beyond discomfort. His left knee was operating on about 60%, and he was compensating with his right side in a way that was going to catch up with him. The blood from the cut above his eye had found a new path down the bridge of his nose and was dripping off the tip of it in a slow metronomic rhythm that he could feel but not see. But none of those things were in the foreground of his awareness right now. In the foreground was Cole's body. The telegraphing, the weight shifts, the barely there tells that lived in the shoulder before the arm committed. And behind all of it, at the very edge of Grant's interior landscape, was a county road in July and 312 acres of winter wheat and a combine that needed an alternator. That was the mission. Everything else was just terrain. Cole threw a desperate right uppercut from close range, going for the chin, and Grant slipped his head outside it and simultaneously locked Cole's right arm under his left arm, a whizzer that he then converted into an arm drag, using the captured limb to pull Cole past him and off balance. And when Cole stumbled forward and turned to face him, Grant was already there. Not with a punch. Not with anything that looked like what it was. He stepped into Cole's space, chest to chest, his right arm going over Cole's left shoulder and his left arm threading under Cole's right arm, and locked his hands behind Cole's neck in a standing rear clinch position that Cole recognized immediately and started fighting immediately, because Cole was well trained and knew what this position led to. He fought it for 3 seconds. Grant stayed with him. His ribs were sending messages that he was not answering. His knee was locking and unlocking with each micro-adjustment of his stance. He held the position through Cole's attempts to spin out of it, through the elbow that Cole drove back into his side that landed on the damaged rib and sent a white line of pain across his vision. He stayed with it because the fight in this clinch was costing Cole more than it was costing Grant, and the math of this moment was simple. Cole's legs buckled slightly, not fatigue exactly, more the cumulative result of 3 knockdowns and 90 seconds of fruitless motion, and his chin came forward a degree. Grant shifted his right arm from the clinch grip to the neck, threading his forearm across Cole's throat, his left arm coming up to reinforce it from the other side, and he stepped back and went to his knees in a controlled descent that took Cole's weight with him and landed them both on the mat with Grant behind Cole and the rear naked choke fully locked. Cole grabbed Grant's forearm with both hands. He pulled, he twisted, he drove his elbow back once more into Grant's ribs, and Grant's vision went gray at the edges again, fully gray this time, a deeper shade, and he tightened the choke because loosening it was not an option and the gray would pass. "Tap," Boggs said, moving in close. "Son, you need to tap." Cole didn't tap. His face was red and getting redder. His hands on Grant's forearm were strong, and then less strong, and then strong again in the irregular, increasingly desperate rhythm of a man whose oxygen supply was being managed by someone else. His legs kicked against the mat, once, twice, 3 times, in the way that legs kick when the brain that directs them is running out of the resource it needs to direct anything. Grant held the choke with everything he had left in his arms. His ribs were on fire. His knee had gone somewhere between pain and numbness. He pressed his forehead against the back of Cole's head and held. The warehouse was the quietest it had been since the opening bell. Not quiet because nothing was happening. Quiet in the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has stopped breathing at the same moment without planning to. Darius had his hands on the top of his head. His face was something Grant couldn't see from the mat, but which the people near ringside would describe later with varying degrees of accuracy, but consistent agreement on one detail. He looked like a man watching something he had been professionally certain would not happen. Cole's hands went from Grant's forearm to the mat. They hovered there for 1 second, fingers spread, palm almost touching the rubber, in the specific posture of a decision. And then, with what looked from the outside like the last thing it was, Cole Mercer slapped the mat twice in quick succession and went still. Grant released him instantly, rolled away. Let Boggs step in. He made it to one knee and stopped there for a moment because his body needed the moment. His hands were on the mat. His head was down. The blood from the cut above his eye dripped onto the rubber in a small dark spot that spread slightly at the edges, and he looked at it for a second without any particular feeling about it. The warehouse noise came back in stages. First the front rows, then the bleachers, then the back, building into something that had no category in Grant's experience because he had never fought in front of a crowd before tonight, and the sound of 200 people reacting to something you'd done was a stranger feeling than he'd expected. Not good, not bad, just large. Too large for the inside of his body to hold, so it pressed against the outside and he let it. He got to his feet. Cole was sitting up with Darius beside him, Darius's hand on his back, Cole's hands on his knees. He was breathing. He was going to be fine. The look on his face was something Grant had seen before in different contexts and different people. The specific, private look of a man coming to terms with a gap between who he believed himself to be and what had just happened to him on a wrestling mat in an abandoned grain warehouse on a July night in a county he'd never heard of before last week. Grant walked to the edge of the mat without looking at the crowd. He picked up his flannel shirt from the nail in the wall. He put it on over the blood and the sweat and the tape on his hands that had gone gray with dirt and effort. Someone was talking to him. Stokes. He was saying something about the money and about a doctor and about not telling anyone who'd organized this, and Grant nodded at the parts that required nodding and didn't acknowledge the parts that didn't. He was looking at his work boots on the concrete floor, 7 years old, resoled twice, the leather creased at the toe box in the specific pattern of a boot that knew the shape of the foot inside it. He sat on the floor, not slowly, not dramatically, just straight down onto the concrete because his knee had made the decision for him, and he pulled the first boot on and laced it, and then pulled the second one on and laced it and stood up. The whole time he was aware, at the edge of his vision, of Cole Mercer still sitting on the mat with Darius's hand on his back. And he was aware in the particular way you're aware of something you're deliberately not looking directly at, not avoiding exactly, more like giving it space. He walked toward the loading dock doors in the night outside. Halfway across the warehouse, someone stepped into his path. Not threatening. A young man, early 20s, with the look of a kid who'd come here with his friends on a dare and was now trying to find language for something he'd seen. "Hey," the kid said. "Man, what?" He stopped. Tried again. "What are you?" Grant looked at him for a moment. "Farmer," he said. He walked through the loading dock doors into the July night, and the heat outside hit him like a wall, and he was grateful for it. The gravel parking lot was quieter than the warehouse, but not quiet. Sound carried through the loading dock doors. Voices, movement, the specific kind of noise a crowd makes when it's trying to process something collectively and not quite managing it. Grant walked to his truck without hurrying and without looking back. He got in, closed the door, sat. The cab smelled like diesel and dry wheat and the particular dusty heat that accumulates in a vehicle left in a July sun for 10 hours. His work gloves were on the dashboard where he'd left them. A receipt from the co-op gas station was folded under the cup holder. $14 of regular unleaded, 3 weeks ago. The last time he'd had $14 to spend on something that wasn't a bill. He put his hands on the steering wheel and looked at them. The tape on his knuckles had gone dark with blood and dirt. His right hand had a deep bruise forming across the second and third metacarpal from the body shot he'd thrown in the third sequence. He'd felt the impact wrong, slightly off angle, and the bone had registered it in the way bones register things when you're 39 and not 22. His left hand was fine. His left hand had always been fine. Left hands tend to survive things more intact than right hands when your right hand is the one that's done most of the work for most of your life. He breathed out through his nose. The ribs pulled. He waited for the pull to subside to something manageable, and when it did, he reached into the glove compartment and took out the bottle of ibuprofen he kept there for the knee and shook 4 into his palm and swallowed them dry. He sat there for another minute. Through the windshield, the county road ran west toward the highway, and beyond the highway toward Blackridge County's main grid of gravel roads that led eventually to his property. The wheat fields out there were standing in the dark right now, 312 acres of them, moisture content perfect, the storm system over Kansas building through the night toward a delivery window that the forecast was currently calling Friday morning. It was now Thursday, just past midnight. He had maybe 40 hours. He started the truck. He was halfway down the county road when headlights appeared in his rear view, close and fast, the kind of following that wasn't coincidental. He kept his speed steady. The headlights stayed with him for a quarter mile and then flashed twice, which in most contexts meant nothing, and in this context meant someone wanted him to stop. Grant pulled onto the shoulder. The vehicle behind him was a newer model pickup, F250, black or dark blue, hard to tell in the dark, and the man who got out of it was Stokes. He walked to the driver's side window with his hands visible, which was either consideration or habit, and Grant rolled it down. "You didn't take your money," Stokes said. Grant looked at him. Then he looked at the envelope in Stokes's hand. He took it. $8.50, Stokes said. "I'm a man of my word, even when I didn't think I'd have to be." Grant set the envelope on the seat beside him without opening it. Stokes stood at the window with one hand on the roof of the cab, not leaving. He was looking at Grant's face in the way people look at things they're trying to read without appearing to be reading them. "You want to tell me what that was?" Stokes said. "A fight." "That wasn't a fight." Stokes paused. "Cole Mercer has knocked out 17 of his 23 opponents. The other 6 he submitted. He's never—" He stopped again. Seemed to be choosing words. "He's never been submitted himself in his life, not in training, not in competition, not in anything like this." Grant said nothing. "So I'm asking," Stokes said, "professionally, as a man who runs these events and has some interest in knowing what walked through his door tonight." "I told the kid," Grant said. "I'm a farmer." Stokes made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Farmers don't move like that." "Some do." "Which ones?" Grant looked at him. The dome light of the cab wasn't on and the county road had no lights, so Stokes was reading him by headlight reflection, which wasn't enough to read much. Grant had spent years being comfortable in low-visibility situations. He let the silence run for a moment. "I'm going to ask you to let me go home now," Grant said. Stokes looked at him for another second. Then he stepped back from the window. "You need a doctor," Stokes said. "Those ribs." "I know what my ribs are doing." "Fair enough." Stokes put his hands in his pockets. "You ever want to do this again? More legitimate setup? Better money? You know how to find me." "I don't," Grant said. He rolled up the window and pulled back onto the road. Well, he didn't go home directly. His left knee had locked badly getting into the truck, and the drive would take 40 minutes on county roads that didn't accommodate distracted driving, and he needed 15 minutes of being stopped before he trusted himself to be moving. He pulled into the parking lot of the Blackridge County feed store, closed since 6, dark, the grain bins behind it casting long shadows in the moonlight, and sat with the engine idling. He opened the envelope. $8.50 in cash, mixed bills, the kind of cash that had been handled a lot and smelled like a wallet. He counted it twice. $850, which was $470 more than he needed for the alternator and labor, which meant he did the math without thinking about it, the same way he did all farm math, automatically, while doing something else. He had enough for the alternator and the labor and the 3 tanks of diesel he'd been rationing for the past 2 weeks, and the prescription he'd been skipping alternate months because of the copay. He put the money back in the envelope. Outside the feed store window, the sky to the southwest had the particular density to it that meant weather building behind it. Not yet visible, not yet close, but the pressure differential was detectable if you'd spent enough years reading it, a heaviness at the edge of the atmosphere, the stars slightly dimmer in that quadrant than in the others. 40 hours. Maybe 36. He pulled out his phone and found the number for Deacon's Auto and Equipment, which was the only parts supplier within 50 miles that carried Case Y, EH components. Deacon's opened at 7 in the morning. He set an alarm for 6:30, which meant he had roughly 6 hours, and he drove home. The farmhouse was dark when he pulled in. It was always dark when he pulled in after nightfall, had been for 3 years, and he had stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing a sound that had been continuous long enough to become part of the background. He parked the truck in the equipment yard, between the grain auger and the stack of old irrigation pipe he kept meaning to sell, and sat for a moment. The combine was in the machine shed 30 yards away. He could see the shed's outline against the sky. The same corrugated steel construction as the Harwell warehouse, just smaller and quieter and belonging to him, which made it entirely different. He got out of the truck. He hadn't intended to go into the machine shed. His body had a position on this, which was that it had worked hard tonight and had not signed up for additional activity. His ribs had been building toward a statement for the past hour, and the statement was arriving now with some force, a deep, gripping ache around the left side of his chest that tightened when he moved his left arm and deepened when he breathed and was going to make sleeping interesting. He went into the machine shed anyway. The combine sat in the center of the space, a yellow and red machine, enormous up close, the header folded up for storage, the cab dark. The engine bay was still open from Tuesday, the way he'd left it when the belt had thrown, and his tools were still laid out on the workbench beside it in the order he used them, because he always laid his tools out in order. Old habit. The kind of habit that gets trained into you and then doesn't leave. He stood beside the machine and put his hand on the engine housing. The metal was cool at this hour. In 8 hours, it would be warm from the sun. In 10, in the heat they'd been having, it would be hot enough to burn. He needed the alternator first. Without the alternator, the machine was a very large, very expensive lawn ornament. But standing here in the dark, looking at the open engine bay, he could already see the sequence of the repair. Alternator bracket, serpentine belt, tension pulley that had been running slightly off-center since spring and might as well be replaced while everything was apart. 4 hours of work, maybe 5, if the bracket bolts had rusted into the housing the way they sometimes did. He could do it in the afternoon, after Deacon's opened, and he had the part. He could do it with cracked ribs and a bad knee, because he'd done more with worse, and the wheat wasn't going to wait for his body to have an opinion about it. He turned the machine shed light off and went inside. He was washing the blood off his face at the kitchen sink when his phone rang. The screen said Rudy Fassbender. It was 12:47 in the morning. Grant looked at the phone for 2 rings. Then he picked up. "Rudy." "I heard," Rudy said. No preamble, no apology for the hour. "Tom Gillespie called me about 20 minutes ago. Said you were in the Harwell building tonight." Grant said nothing. "Tom was there watching. He said—" Rudy stopped, a pause that had weight in it. "He said Cole Mercer tapped out." "He did." Another pause. Longer. "Grant," Rudy said. Then he didn't say anything else for a moment, which was unusual for Rudy, who was a man who used language comfortably and in quantity. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Tom said you were bleeding pretty good when you walked out." "Eyebrow cut. It's done." "Your ribs?" "Rudy." "Yeah." "I got the money. I'm getting the alternator in the morning. I need to sleep." A pause. "You should have called me is what you should have done. If I'd known it was that bad with the combine, I would have. You told me you were upside down on the pivot." "I know what I told you." Rudy's voice had something in it now, not guilt exactly, more the particular discomfort of a good man who'd made a reasonable decision and was looking at the cost of it from the outside. "I still could have figured something out. You didn't have to go and—" He stopped again. "I needed the money before Friday," Grant said. "It's done. I have it. Tom said you fought like—" Rudy paused, reconsidered. "He said it didn't look like a first fight." Grant turned the cold water off at the sink and stood looking at his reflection in the dark window above it. The eyebrow cut had stopped bleeding and was starting to close on its own. Not deep enough to need stitches, probably, if he kept it clean. His cheekbone had swelled slightly where Cole's second right hand had landed. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been in a fight. "Get some sleep, Rudy," Grant said. "What was it?" Rudy said. "Before the farm. What did you do?" Grant looked at his reflection. "Night, Rudy." He hung up. "Eat that." He was up at 6:15 before the alarm because his body had decided 6 hours was sufficient regardless of what he thought about it. His ribs had settled overnight from acute to chronic, less like fire, more like a stone sitting in the wrong place inside him, shifting whenever he moved. He got up carefully. The way you get up when getting up is a project, and stood beside the bed for a moment, letting his knee find its position. The knee was worse than the ribs in the morning, swollen noticeably, stiff through the first 15 steps in a way that always improved with movement but never fully resolved. He'd been managing it since May with ibuprofen and stubbornness, and this morning he was managing it the same way. He made coffee. Drank it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down and getting up again was a negotiation he didn't want to have twice. Through the window, the southwest sky had more density to it now than last night. The weather system was moving, taking on definition, the kind of definition that a farmer in wheat country recognized as a deadline. His phone had 3 new messages, 2 from numbers he didn't recognize, 1 from a number he recognized but hadn't expected. The 2 unknown numbers he ignored. The third one he looked at for a moment, then he opened it. "This is Cole Mercer. Got your number from Stokes. I know that's probably not okay. I just wanted to say, I don't know, I wanted to say something. Call me if you want. If you don't, I understand." Grant read it twice. He set the phone on the counter and drank his coffee and looked at the southwest sky. At 6:45, he called Deacon's Auto and Equipment and reached the voicemail, which told him they opened at 7. He called back at 7:02 and a woman named Sandra answered, and he gave her the part number for the Case IH alternator. He'd looked up Tuesday afternoon, and she told him they had one in stock. A remanufactured unit, $280. "I'll be there at 8, Grant said. "We'll have it at the counter." He drove to Deacon's. He drove carefully because his knee didn't want to work the clutch, and his ribs had something to say about shoulder checking. He drove the county roads at the speed he always drove them, which was not the speed limit, which was what you did when you'd driven the same roads for 14 years and knew where the frost heaves were and where the deer crossed in the morning. The sky behind him in the rear view was clear and blue in the way July mornings were in this part of the state. The sky ahead of him, to the southwest, was a different color, still blue but darker at the bottom, where it met the horizon, and the darkness had a greenish undertone that wasn't dramatic yet, but was progressing. Deacon's was a low concrete block building with a gravel lot and a parts counter that smelled like oil and rubber and the specific dust of a place that had been exactly this place for 40 years. Sandra was a heavy-set woman in her 60s who worked the counter with the efficiency of someone who knew every part number in a 3,000-square-foot parts room without looking anything up. She set the alternator box on the counter when he walked in, and he paid her in cash from the envelope, $280, and she looked at his face the way people in small towns look at things that are unusual and then don't ask about them, which is a specifically rural form of respect. "You need anything else while you're here?" Sandra said. "Serpentine belt for a 2009 Case IH 7088, and a tension pulley if you have one." She had both. He paid for those too. His total was $364, which left him $486 from the envelope, which was more liquid cash than he'd had in a single place at one time since February. He was loading the parts into the truck when a second vehicle pulled into the lot beside him. He didn't recognize the car at first. A newer Chevy Silverado, dark red, clean, with the kind of small chrome details that said it belonged to someone who washed it regularly. Then the driver got out, and Grant recognized him. Cole Mercer didn't look like he'd slept. He was wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, and he was moving slightly carefully in a way that suggested his hip was reminding him of the mat last night, and his right ear was swollen along the upper helix where Grant's elbow had caught it in the second round. Without the rash guard and the crowd and the warehouse, he looked younger, 28 going on about 24. He stopped when he saw Grant. His expression went through several things in quick succession before settling on something that was honest and slightly uncomfortable. "I wasn't following you," Cole said. I saw the truck from the road." Grant looked at him, then he looked at the parts box in his hands. He put it in the truck bed. "How'd you know what truck was mine?" Grant said. Cole looked briefly caught. "I asked Stokes. You asked Stokes what truck I drove." "I know how that sounds." "How does it sound?" "Like I was following you." Cole ran a hand through his hair. "I wasn't. I wanted to talk to you and I sent you a text and you didn't." He stopped. "Look, I was going to stop at a gas station. I saw your truck. I pulled in. That's it." Grant closed the tailgate. He turned and leaned against it with his arms crossed, which his ribs registered a complaint about, which he ignored. Cole stood in the gravel lot with his hands at his sides. He wasn't performing anything. No posture, no angle, just a young man who had gotten on an airplane and driven to a county he didn't know because something had happened in a warehouse that he was still trying to fit into a framework that made sense. "What do you want?" Grant said. Cole looked at him. "I want to know who taught you." "Nobody taught me." "That's not true." Grant said nothing. "The wrist redirect in the third. The whizzer conversion. The clinch entry you used before the choke." Cole shook his head slightly. "That's not YouTube stuff. That's not gym stuff. I don't even know what program runs that curriculum." "Maybe you should think about what that says about your curriculum," Grant said. Cole looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I've been thinking about that. A beat." "I'm not angry," Cole said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because I'm here because I need to understand something. You don't need to understand it. It's over." "For you, maybe." Grant looked at him. Cole was holding his gaze in a way that took some effort, which Grant noticed, which told him something about the kid's actual character, that he was capable of discomfort without fleeing it. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Cole said. I've never—" He stopped, started differently. "I've never been in a position where I didn't know how to handle what was in front of me. Not since I was 19, not in sparring, not in competition, not in anything. First time for everything." "That's not—" Cole took a breath. "I'm trying to have a conversation with you." "I know you are. So talk to me." Grant looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the southwest sky over the Deacon's roof line. The color there had shifted since he'd arrived, more defined now. The bottom edge of the weather system was visible as a slightly darker line at the horizon, the kind that still looked like nothing from this distance but would look like something significant by mid-afternoon. "I have a combine to fix," Grant said. "I know. You said last night—" Cole stopped. "You said you needed the money for a part." "Alternator, I got it." "Okay." Cole seemed to be weighing something. "I can turn a wrench if you need another set of hands." Grant looked at him. Cole shrugged, a small, slightly self-conscious gesture that was the most human thing Grant had seen him do. "I worked in my uncle's shop for 3 summers. I know what a serpentine belt is." "You drove 40 minutes to find a stranger to help fix his combine." "I drove 40 minutes because I couldn't sleep and I needed to—" Cole stopped himself. "Yeah, I guess I did." Grant was quiet for a moment. "You'll slow me down," Grant said. "Probably," Cole said. "At first." Grant looked at the sky again. Then he picked up the last box from the truck bed and handed it to Cole, the tension pulley, the heaviest of the 3 parts, without explanation. Cole took it. "Don't touch anything until I tell you to," Grant said. "Understood. And if I say stop, you stop. My equipment, my rules." "Fair." Grant got in the truck. Cole stood in the gravel lot for a second, looking at the truck, and then walked to his Silverado. He followed Grant out of the lot and onto the county road, and they drove in convoy through the July morning toward Black Ridge County. Check it. They worked for 4 hours. The alternator bracket bolts had rusted into the housing, which Grant had expected, and the first 40 minutes were a negotiation between a half-inch socket, a breaker bar, and the particular stubbornness of steel that had been fused by heat and moisture for 15 years. Cole held the flashlight and handed tools when asked, and made exactly one suggestion, about the penetrating oil angle that Grant ignored and then tried 20 minutes later when his own approach hadn't worked, which was the correct order of events. The belt went on clean. The tension pulley was worse than the alternator, seized in its bracket in a way that required heat from a propane torch, which Grant applied carefully because there was still chaff in corners of the engine bay, and chaff and open flame had a specific relationship he preferred not to explore. Cole worked without talking much, which was the right call. He read the rhythm of the job, when to hand something, when to stay back, when to ask rather than assume, with a practical intelligence that Grant filed without commenting on. Around the 3rd hour, Cole said, "You're left-handed." Grant was torquing the alternator bracket with his right hand. "Ambidextrous. Right is dominant. You fight left dominant." "I know. Most people don't have the control to switch like that under pressure." Grant didn't answer. Cole was quiet for another few minutes. Then, "How long were you in?" Grant finished the torque and moved to the next bolt. 11 years. "Combat?" "Some." "Where?" Grant looked at him across the engine bay. Cole put his hands up slightly. "You don't have to—" "Couple of places," Grant said. "Different times." "Special operations?" Grant picked up the next bolt. "The way you move," Cole said. "The way you manage. You don't react. You read. You're 2 steps ahead, and you don't look like you're working for it." He paused. "That's not infantry." "You're asking a lot of questions for a man who said he just wanted to talk." "I said I needed to understand something." "You don't need all of it to understand it." Cole was quiet. Then, "What do I need?" Grant set down the socket. He stood up straight, which his ribs objected to, and looked at Cole across the combine engine bay. "You need to know that last night wasn't about you," Grant said. "It wasn't about proving anything or winning anything. I needed $850 and I had something worth trading for it, and I made a trade. Cole absorbed that. That's it? Cole said. That's it. That's not... Cole shook his head. That can't be what it felt like from in there. I know what it felt like from in there, Grant said. I've been in there before. Different there, same feeling. At some point it stops being about what you know and starts being about what you're willing to do. And I was willing to do more than you expected. Because you've had to, Cole said. Grant picked the socket back up. Hand me the 3/8. Cole handed it to him. They worked in silence for a while. The southwest sky above the open machine shed door had changed again. The darkness at the horizon was taller now, the greenish undertone more pronounced, and there was a shift in the air pressure that showed up as a slight change in the way sound traveled. Everything slightly flatter, slightly more compressed. 48 hours, Cole said, looking at the sky. Maybe less. I know. You're going to get this done in time? I have to. Cole looked at the combine, then at Grant. What do you need me to do? Grant looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Get in the cab. I'll walk you through starting the diagnostic sequence. I need to know if the electrical came back clean when the alternator engaged. Cole climbed up into the cab without another word. Grant stood at the engine bay and talked him through it. Check this light, toggle this switch. Tell me what the voltage reading says on the secondary display. Cole followed the sequence carefully, reading the numbers back in a clear, flat voice that had the cadence of someone accustomed to following technical instructions, and the numbers came back clean. 14.2 volts. The alternator was charging. The electrical system was alive. Grant put his hand on the engine housing the same way he'd done last night in the dark. This time it was warm from running. Good? Cole called from the cab. Good, Grant said. Cole climbed down. They stood on either side of the combine in the machine shed with the sky outside going heavier and the wheat standing in the fields beyond the shed door and the morning burning toward noon. Cole looked at his hands. There was grease on them. He looked at the grease with the slightly rueful expression of someone who'd signed up for something and was finding it wasn't what they pictured. Last night, Cole said. He didn't finish the sentence right away. I told Darius after you left, after they'd checked me out and everything was fine. I told him I wasn't going to do this anymore. Grant looked at him. Not fighting, Cole said. The underground stuff. The Stokes circuit. He paused. 23 fights. I told myself each one was going to be the last one before I got a real manager and did it right. Did it legitimate. He picked up a shop rag from the workbench and wiped his hands. I kept not doing it right because doing it right meant possibly losing in a real venue with a real record, and He stopped. I hadn't lost before last night. You were protecting something, Grant said. Yeah. What? Cole was quiet for a moment. The version of me that doesn't lose. Grant took the shop rag from him and wiped his own hands. That version doesn't exist, he said. You know that now. I know that now. It's better when you know it. Cole looked at him. Something moved across his face. Not agreement exactly, more the specific look of someone receiving information they weren't ready for and deciding to hold it until they were. You ever lose? Cole asked. Grant looked out the machine shed door at the fields. The wheat was moving in the light pre-storm breeze, a slow, rolling movement that went all the way to the tree line at the far edge of the property. And in the moving wheat you could see the way the light was changing as the sky changed, the gold going slightly brassy as the weather built behind it. Yeah, Grant said. I've lost. Bad? Grant looked at him. Bad enough, he said, and that was the end of it. Cole nodded. He understood, in the way you understand things that aren't fully explained, that this particular door was not one he was going to be walked through today, and that pressing on it would be the wrong thing to do. He picked up his keys from the workbench where he'd set them 3 hours ago. I'm going to find a real camp, Cole said. Legitimate promotion, real record. He paused. If I lose there, I lose there. Good, Grant said. I might be terrible. You're not terrible, Grant said. You're good. You just thought you were better than good. Cole almost smiled. Not quite. That's a nicer way to say it than I expected. Don't get used to it. Cole extended his hand. Grant looked at it for a moment, then took it. The handshake was brief and direct and said what it needed to say, which wasn't much, which was exactly right. Cole walked to his truck. He got in. He pulled out of the equipment yard onto the county road, and Grant watched the dark red Silverado until it reached the first bend in the road and disappeared behind the tree row. Then he turned back to the combine. The belt needed a final tension check. The pulley bracket needed 2 more bolts torqued to spec. The engine bay cover needed to go back on, and the header needed to be unfolded and the hydraulics checked before he took it into the field. 2 hours of work, maybe less. He picked up his wrench. The pulley bracket took the last 2 bolts without argument, which was the first mechanical courtesy the combine had extended him in a week, and he accepted it without comment. He torqued them to spec, replaced the engine bay cover, and stood back to look at the machine the way you look at something you've just repaired. Not with satisfaction exactly, more with the particular wariness of a man who has been let down before and knows better than to trust a single good morning. He wiped his hands on the shop rag. The header unfolded cleanly when he ran the hydraulics, a slow mechanical bloom of the cutting platform extending to its full 35-foot width, the reel dropping into position, everything moving the way it was supposed to move, which was the way it had always moved before Tuesday, and which he had spent the last 3 days not taking for granted. He checked the knife sections along the cutter bar, found one loose and tightened it, found another with a cracked blade segment, and replaced it from the spare parts bin in the corner of the shed. That cost him 20 minutes he hadn't budgeted for, but a cracked knife section in standing wheat caused feeding problems that cost more time than the replacement, and he'd learned that lesson once already in 2019 and didn't need to learn it again. By the time he climbed into the cab for the full systems check, it was 11:40 in the morning. The sky above the open shed door was doing something more serious now. The line at the southwestern horizon had risen while he worked, no longer a subtle darkening but an actual wall of weather, defined and purposeful, the kind of sky structure that farmers learned early in life to read as a promise rather than a threat. Not because it wasn't threatening, because it was the kind of threat that kept its word. He ran through the cab diagnostics. Grain tank sensor, functional. Feeder house, functional. Separator, functional. The threshing cylinder speed read correctly. The cleaning shoe was set for winter wheat at 13% moisture. The yield monitor, which he'd given up trying to calibrate in May because the software had an issue he couldn't afford to have serviced, showed its usual nonsense number, but he'd stopped caring about yield monitor accuracy after the first drought year taught him that the elevator scale was the only number that mattered. 14.2 volts from the alternator. Steady, clean. He sat in the cab for a moment. Through the cab glass, his fields ran from the equipment yard fence all the way to the county road on the north side and the tree row on the south. 312 acres of winter wheat standing at full height, the heads heavy and gold in the pre-storm light, the whole field moving in the wind that was picking up now ahead of the system. The movement of a wheat field in wind had a quality he'd never been able to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. It wasn't random, it rolled. It moved in patterns that the wind wrote across the surface of it like text in a language that didn't have an alphabet. His wife had loved it. That was the thing he'd been not thinking about all morning, and was now, for whatever reason, thinking about. Ellen had grown up in Kansas City and had never seen a wheat field until he brought her to Black Ridge County, the first summer after he got out. And the first time they'd walked the fence line together in June, when the wheat was just starting to head out, she'd stopped and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. And then she'd said, "It moves like water." And he'd said, "Yeah." And that had been the whole conversation, but it was one of the ones he remembered best. 3 years since the accident. Long enough that the acute grief had become something structural, less like a wound and more like a change in the architecture of him, a weight-bearing wall that had been modified and now carried the load differently than it had before. Not better, not worse. Different. You lived around it. You made adjustments. He climbed down from the cab. He still had 2 hours of preparation before he could put the machine in the field. The grain cart needed to be hitched to the tractor, the grain wagon positioned at the field entrance, the header height set for the current straw condition. None of it was complicated. All of it required moving his body through space in ways his ribs were going to have an ongoing conversation with him about. He started on the grain cart. Rudy Fassbender showed up at 1:15. Grant heard the truck before he saw it. Rudy's F350 with the diesel that ticked on deceleration, a sound as familiar as the creek behind the south pasture. He came around the side of the machine shed pulling his own grain wagon, which was newer than Grant's and had a better auger setup, and he unhitched it and positioned it beside Grant's at the field entrance without asking, and then walked over to where Grant was working on the tractor hookup. "You don't have to do that," Grant said. "I know I don't." Rudy looked at the sky, then at the combine, now sitting outside the machine shed with the header extended. "She running?" "Just finished the check." "Good." Rudy bent and looked at the hitch connection Grant was working on. "You've got the cleveson wrong." "I know. I'm fixing it." "You want me to—" "I've got it, Rudy." Rudy straightened up and put his hands in his pockets and watched. He was a big man, 6'3", broad through the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that had made him useful in various contexts over 64 years of life in a county where things needed doing. And he had the farmer's patience for waiting, which was a particular kind of patience that wasn't actually patient so much as it was resigned to the timeline of things. "Janet said to ask if you need food," Rudy said. "I'm fine. She made that elk chili from the November deer." "It's elk or deer, Rudy, not both." "Elk. The chili's elk. The point is, there's a lot of it." "I'm fine." Rudy was quiet for a moment. "Tom Gillespie won't shut up," he said. "Called me twice more this morning. Says half the county's heard about last night." Grant fixed the clevis and stood up. "Tom Gillespie should take up a hobby. He's not wrong that people are talking." "People talk. It doesn't cost me anything." Rudy looked at him. The specific look of a man who has known another man long enough to read the things he doesn't say. "Derek from the bank called me this morning," Rudy said. "Looking for you." Grant stopped. "Derek," Grant said. "Yeah. Said he wanted to talk to you about your situation. Use that word, situation." Rudy's voice was neutral in a way that was deliberate. Said maybe there was some flexibility he hadn't considered in April. Grant looked at the field. The wheat moved. "He heard," Grant said. "Small county. He didn't want to help me 3 days ago." "No," Rudy said. "He didn't." A beat. "I'm not calling him back," Grant said. "Didn't figure you would." Rudy looked at the sky again. "You want another operator? I can run the grain cart tractor. Keep the wagon cycle tight so you're not waiting on me." Grant looked at him. "I'd have to pay you," Grant said. Rudy made a sound. "The hell you would. I've been your neighbor for 14 years and I left you short when you needed it. Let me run a tractor for an afternoon." Grant's ribs pulled when he turned back to the equipment. He hadn't eaten since last night. The ibuprofen on an empty stomach was starting to make its opinion known. And he was running on 6 hours of sleep and a fight that his body hadn't finished processing. He was going to be harvesting in that condition, in a cab that vibrated constantly and required constant attention and had no comfortable position for a man with damaged ribs and a swollen knee, for as long as it took to cut 312 acres ahead of a storm that was going to arrive on its own schedule, regardless of his. He looked at Rudy. "You eat before you came over?" Grant said. "Janet made me eat before she'd let me leave the house." "There's coffee in the kitchen. Take some with you if you want it." Rudy nodded once and walked toward the house. He'd been in Grant's kitchen enough times that he didn't need directions and wouldn't wait to be led, which was exactly what Grant needed right now. A man who could be useful without requiring management. Grant climbed into the combine cab. He made his first cut at 2:17 in the afternoon. The combine moved into the standing wheat from the north end of the field, the end farthest from the approaching weather, working south, which meant he was harvesting toward the storm rather than away from it, which was backward from how you'd want it if you were planning a comfortable afternoon, and exactly how you'd do it if you were trying to buy every possible acre before the rain hit. The wheat went into the header in the rolling, continuous way that healthy wheat in good condition goes in when the machine is set correctly, and the sound of the threshing cylinder, that deep, sustained mechanical rumble that he'd been listening to for 6 harvests and that had been absent since Tuesday morning, filled the cab and settled into his chest alongside everything else that was already there. The ribs complained about the vibration. He noted it and drove. In his rear-view camera, Rudy's tractor moved parallel to his path along the field edge, the grain wagon positioned to receive the combine's tank when it filled. Rudy had been running a grain cart for 40 years. He didn't need instruction and didn't ask for it. The yield monitor showed its nonsense number. Grant ignored it. The first tank filled in 32 minutes, which told him the crop was yielding at the higher end of what he'd estimated, maybe 55, 60 bushels per acre if it held, which would put the field somewhere around 18,000 bushels total, which at current prices was a number he didn't let himself calculate yet, because calculating it too early was the kind of thing that went wrong in ways you didn't anticipate. He opened the tank auger and swung over to Rudy's wagon without stopping the combine, a move that required matching speeds and holding a precise lateral position that his ribs did not appreciate, but that he executed cleanly because he'd done it thousands of times, and his body knew how to do it even when it was doing it unhappy. Rudy's voice crackled on the field radio. "Tank's taking it clean. Nice crop." "Don't say it yet," Grant said. "Don't say it yet, Rudy." A pause. "Fair enough." The weather arrived at 4:45. It didn't arrive with the dramatic suddenness that storms in movies arrived with. It arrived the way actual weather arrived, with a gradual darkening that you watched happen over an hour, the wind direction shifting from southwest to south, and then backing to southeast in a way that meant the system was close enough to start defining itself, the humidity rising in a way you felt on your skin and in your lungs, the quality of the light going from gold to brass to something flatter and less definite. The first lightning struck somewhere south of the tree row at 4:52. Distant. He had a window still. He drove. His phone had 3 missed calls he hadn't looked at. His ribs had moved from chronic ache to something more pointed in the last hour, the vibration of the machine working at the injury in a way that was cumulative and not entirely ignorable. His left knee had fully stiffened in the fixed cab position. When he'd climbed out to check a stone strike on the cutter bar an hour ago, he'd had to hold the grab rail and lower himself down one-handed like someone twice his age, which Rudy had seen and not commented on, which Grant appreciated. He was on his 4th pass down the field when his phone buzzed on the console. He glanced at the screen. Cole Mercer. He let it buzz. It buzzed again 30 seconds later, a text this time. He didn't look at it until the tank was full and he was swinging back to the wagon. While Rudy's tank was taking the grain, he picked up the phone. "I called a manager today, real one, based out of Tulsa. He's seen my fight footage. He wants to meet next week. Thought you should know. Also, I don't really know why I'm telling you this. Take care of your wheat." Grant read it twice. He set the phone down. The auger finished. He pulled back to his cut line and drove. The rain started at 6:19. Not a downpour. Not yet. A preliminary rain, the kind that came ahead of the main event, heavy drops spaced far enough apart that you could see them individually hitting the standing wheat ahead of the header, each one raising a small puff of dust where it struck the dry soil between the rows. Not enough to stop combining. Not yet. He had 47 acres left. He drove faster. The machine had a maximum ground speed that was set by the crop condition. Too fast and you overwhelmed the threshing cylinder, left grain in the field, hurt the sample quality. He pushed the upper edge of what the wheat would allow and stayed there, watching his mirrors, watching the header, watching the sky. Rudy had moved the full wagon to the field entrance and come back with the empty one. He'd made 3 wagon cycles without needing to be told anything, timed them perfectly, kept his radio traffic to the minimum required, which was almost nothing. There were things you couldn't know about a person until you worked alongside them, and working alongside Rudy Fassbender in a harvest field told Grant everything about why the man had been farming the same land successfully for 40 years. The rain intensified at 6:44. Still manageable. He watched the header for signs of material going through wrong. Wheat in certain rain conditions started wrapping on the reel, feeding unevenly, causing slugging in the cylinder that killed your efficiency and sometimes your time. Not yet. The crop was dry enough still that the rain was hitting the surface without penetrating. "How much left?" Rudy on the radio. "Maybe 30. Sky doesn't look like 30. "I know. Grant, I know, Rudy. He drove. The lightning was closer now. He could hear the thunder following it, 5 seconds between flash and crack, which put the core of the storm at roughly a mile, moving northeast, which meant it was going to cross the field from left to right in his current orientation, moving faster than he was harvesting. 28 acres. The rain hit the cab windshield with enough force at 6:59 that the wipers, which he hadn't used since April, came on automatically. He watched the header. The crop was starting to flag, the wheat heads drooping slightly as the surface moisture accumulated, the feeding becoming slightly less clean, the cylinder load varying in a way the instrument panel registered as a warning tone. He pulled back on the ground speed, traded acres per hour for cylinder stability. 23 acres. The phone buzzed. He didn't look at it. The field radio. Grain's getting tough to auger. Moisture's up. How much? Sample feels like 15, maybe 15.5. He did the math. 15% moisture was still within elevator acceptance at some discounts. 15.5 started getting into territory where they'd dock him or reject the load, which meant he'd have to run it through his grain dryer, which meant propane costs that ate into the margin, which meant he stopped calculating. One problem at a time, cut the acres first, dry what needed drying later. 19 acres. Thunder at 3 seconds. He felt it in the cab, a physical pressure change, a bass note that the combine's sound couldn't fully cover. The lightning that preceded it had been close enough to light the cab in the flat white way that came from proximity rather than angle. Grant! Rudy's voice on the radio was flat and serious. I see it. We're in the field. I see it, Rudy. Stay in your cab. You can't. Stay in your cab. 15 acres. The rain became what rain eventually became in a storm like this. A continuous weight falling vertically, then diagonally, then vertically again as the wind inside the system organized itself. The wipers couldn't keep up with it. He was navigating by the GPS guidance line on the console screen and by the edge of the cut, wheat visible through the right side of the cab glass, keeping his cut line by feel and geometry the way he'd been keeping cut lines for 14 harvests in conditions ranging from fine to exactly this. His ribs had achieved a level of discomfort that had gone beyond his ability to subdivide. It wasn't a specific pain anymore. It was a condition, a general full-body awareness that everything was costing more than it should and that the account was running low. He drove. 12 acres. The cylinder warning tone came on and stayed on. The wet wheat was slugging through unevenly now, the material too heavy with rain to feed cleanly, and he pulled the ground speed back to the minimum that still made progress and watched the warning tone and kept moving. 8 acres. The lightning was continuous now in the way that late-stage storm lightning was continuous. Not individual strikes with recovery between them, but a sustained electrical conversation between cloud and ground that lit the sky in the east where it was clearing and the sky in the west where it wasn't in alternating flashes that turned the wet wheat ahead of him gold and then dark and then gold again. He thought about nothing. Not the money, not the ribs, not Ellen looking at a wheat field in June and saying it moves like water, not a country he'd served in and never spoken about, not a young man in a dark red truck driving toward a city and a manager and a legitimate record and the first loss that would be on the books for anyone to see. He thought about the cut line, the cylinder load, the acres remaining. 5, 3, 1. He made the final pass down the last acre of standing wheat at 8:14 in the evening, in rain that was hitting the cab so hard it was audible over the threshing cylinder, and when the head cleared the last row of standing crop and entered the cut stubble of his previous pass, he lifted the header and stopped the machine and sat. Outside, in every direction visible through the rain-covered glass, was his field. 312 acres of cut stubble, standing in the rain, the short wheat stems all that remained of what had been standing grain this morning. The field looked different empty, smaller somehow, and larger at the same time, the way places look when you remove the thing that defined them. He turned off the threshing cylinder, turned off the feeder house. The combine went quiet in stages, the loudest machine in his life every harvest becoming a box of silence in the rain. He sat, His hands were on his knees, and he was looking straight ahead through the windshield at his cut field in the rain, and his chest was doing something that wasn't crying and wasn't quite not crying either, something in between that his body had apparently decided it was doing and that he was not going to argue with in the cab of his Combine at 8:15 on a Thursday night with no one watching. It lasted about 45 seconds. Then he picked up the field radio. "Rudy, go ahead." "I'm done." A long pause. When Rudy spoke again, his voice had something in it that Grant recognized as the particular warmth of a man who had been watching something hard happen to someone he cared about and was doing his level best to communicate that without making it into a production. "Yeah," Rudy said. "I can see that. Take the wagon home. I'll come get it tomorrow when the road dries." "Already moving." A pause. "Grant." "Yeah." "Good harvest." Grant looked at the field. "Yeah," he said. "Good harvest." He set the radio on the console. He sat in the quiet cab and listened to the rain on the roof. A sound that was two things simultaneously. The sound of the problem he'd spent 3 days solving, arriving too late to be a problem, and the sound of the next growing season's moisture beginning to accumulate in soil that needed it. Rain is rain. It was the timing that made it one thing or another. He drove the Combine back to the machine shed in the rain, moving slowly through the dark field, and parked it inside and closed the shed doors. He showered, stood in the kitchen afterward with wet hair and dry clothes, and ate cold rice from the refrigerator because it was there, and he needed something, and he wasn't going to cook at 8:30 on a night like this. He took 4 more ibuprofen. He sat at the kitchen table. He picked up his phone. 6 missed calls. 2 from the unknown numbers, 1 from Derek at the bank, 1 from Tom Gillespie, who definitely needed a hobby, 1 from a number with an Oklahoma City area code he didn't recognize, 1 from Cole. He called Cole back. 3 rings. Then, "Hey, Grant said. "You get a meeting set?" "Next Tuesday," Cole said. "Tulsa." A pause. "You done with the harvest?" "Just finished." "Beat the rain?" "Barely." "Good." Cole was quiet for a moment. "How are your ribs?" "They'll be fine. You should get them x-rayed." "I know what cracked ribs feel like, Cole." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be." Grant looked at the table. There was a scratch in the wood that had been there since he moved in, a long diagonal mark from some piece of equipment or tool moved carelessly by the previous owner. He'd meant to sand it out and refinish the table for 2 years and hadn't. He looked at the scratch. "You did good today," he said. "With the wrench work." Silence. "That might be the nicest thing you've said to me," Cole said. "Don't let it go to your head." "Already did." Another pause. "The manager in Tulsa, his name is Roy Carver. He said he wants me in a regional promotion in September. First one on record." "You ready for that?" "No," Cole said. "I don't think so." "Good," Grant said. "How is that good?" "Because you know you're not ready. 2 weeks ago you thought you were ready for anything." Grant looked out the kitchen window at the dark. The rain was lighter now. The front had passed, the trailing edge coming through in steady but diminishing rain. Not knowing you're not ready is the dangerous version. Knowing you're not ready and going anyway is just being alive. Cole was quiet for a moment. "You ever going to tell me where you served?" he said. "Probably not." "Why?" Grant looked at the scratch in the table. "Because it's done. It's not what I am now." "What are you now?" Grant thought about 312 acres of cut wheat standing in the rain, about an alternator bracket and a serpentine belt and a machine that had started when he needed it to start, about a fight in an abandoned warehouse that he'd needed to have and had and was finished with, about a table with a scratch in it in a house that was his. "I'm a farmer," he said. A pause. Then Cole said, "Yeah, I know." His voice had something in it. Not irony, not quite respect, something more personal than either. "Take care of yourself, Grant." "You too, son." He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes, listening to the rain. It was lighter now, softer. the kind of rain that didn't have an agenda, just water falling because the conditions called for it. Through the window, the yard was dark except for the security light on the machine shed, which threw a yellow circle on the wet gravel that shimmered slightly when the rain touched it. He got up. He went to the closet in the hallway, the one that still had Ellen's raincoat on the left side hook, which he hadn't moved in 3 years and wasn't going to move tonight, and took his own jacket off the right hook and put it on. He went out the back door. The rain touched his face when he stepped off the porch. He walked across the equipment yard in the dark, through the gate at the field edge and out into the cut wheat stubble. He walked to the center of the field and stopped. Everything was dark and wet and quiet in the specific way of a place where something large has just finished happening. The stubble was ankle high, the cut ends of the wheat stalks releasing that smell, grain and dust and something green underneath. The live part of the plant that was still in the root, still in the soil, already beginning the process of next year from the bottom up. The rain fell on him. Not hard, just steady. He stood there for a while. He was 39 years old, he had cracked ribs and a bad knee, and $64 in his checking account and $486 in cash in an envelope on the kitchen counter, and 18,000 bushels of winter wheat in his grain bins, and a combine that was running, and a mortgage that wasn't going anywhere, and a house with a scratch in the kitchen table that he hadn't gotten around to fixing. He had gotten through this year. That was the whole of it. Nothing more complicated than that. You got through the year, and then next year came, and you got through that one too. And that was the work. Not glorious, not lost on anyone who hadn't done it, just the endless serious business of staying when staying was hard. He'd learned that in the military, and learned it again on this land, and he expected he'd spend the rest of his life learning it in one form or another. You didn't get to stop learning it. The only people who stopped learning it were the ones who stopped. He turned and walked back toward the house. His boots were wet through by the time he reached the gate, the water soaking through the old leather in a way that the risoling hadn't fixed and probably couldn't fix. He'd need new boots before spring. One thing at a time. The machine shed light through its yellow circle on the wet gravel. The house was dark except for the kitchen window, lit from inside, a square of light in the wet dark that was his. He went in. He hung his wet jacket on the right hook. He pulled his wet boots off at the door and set them to the side to dry. He went to the kitchen, turned off the light, and went to bed. He was asleep in 4 minutes. Outside, the rain moved through, carrying what it carried and leaving what it left, the way weather always did. Indifferent to the plans of the people beneath it, indifferent to their losses and their recoveries, indifferent to everything except the conditions that made it rain. The wheat stubble stood in the dark field and the rain fell on it, and the roots held in the soil, and the whole thing was, in its quiet way, already beginning again.